Welcome back to Bootstrap 4 by Example. My name is Sean Wildermuth and I'm your instructor. In this module, we'll talk about components. Let's get started. In the first three modules, we've dug into some of the very basics of Bootstrap 4, but now we're going to head into the components. So far in the course, you've seen mostly the basic styling of Bootstrap 4, but now we're going to introduce components. The components are all implemented as jQuery extensions. You can use most of them or many of them without JavaScript. Some do require setup using JavaScript. You can also improve the performance of some of these components by using JavaScript to limit their scope. The components we're going to be talking about in this module include button groups, drop-downs, input groups, tooltips, alerts, popovers, and cards. Let's dig into some code. Let's start out with something called button groups. If we open up our contact page, this is the page that we added all the form elements to. Let's come down and add a new part of our form right before the message. We'll do this by creating a form group first, then a label, and then just a div here. And inside this div, create a button that has the .btn for button and the btn success for a green button. And I'm just going to create three favorites. The sun, choose a little editor inheritance here, and say Earth, or everyone's favorite, the moon. The idea here is if we look in the browser, we'll now see three options, just three regular buttons. There's nothing special about them yet, but we'd like to turn this into data that can be sent along with the form. In order to do this, we can just put in this collection around the button, the class button group. And what this looks like in the UI is that it now looks like three individual objects. Because we want them on a separate line, we can then surround this in its own div. We could have created a wrapper around the button group as well, but just to make sure we get what we want, because suddenly this button group doesn't become block display anymore. That's why we need a block display over it. There are other ways to fix this, but this is a cheap and easy one. Now we can see it the way we want it. And you'll notice that it's showing them together like one group of buttons. And the idea would be that when you click them, they would select each other. But all the button group does is change the look and feel. We could use this in cases where we actually want buttons or even anchors to look this way. The button group just changes the look and feel. If we go back to the code, we can also change this to be different kinds of button groups, like a vertical button group instead. You get that same mechanic of mixing the three buttons, but now it's vertically aligned, even though you're going to treat them as separate buttons entirely. Notice that it doesn't have room behind them, and they look connected. And you can use the button group small or large to change their relative size. Instead of having to change each and every button, we can use button group LG and SM to go ahead and change the size of them as well. And I'm going to go ahead and leave off either of those and just go back to our regular button group. In order to make this a collection of the data we want, we can actually change this a little bit. And this time we're going to make each of these a label. And you're going to leave the class names on them. We're just going to put it before them, input type, let's say, checkbox. Internally, we want these to actually be treated as things we can toggle on and off. And by making it a checkbox internally, the checkbox isn't going to show up, but it is going to allow us to use these as inputs. And then if we come up here to group, we can add two things to sort of make this all work. The first is button group toggle and data toggle equals buttons. And back in the browser, we now have the sun and earth and the moon, but we can now select each one of them individually. And the reason why that's important is that because they're checkboxes, we can turn them on and off. It's going to treat it as like a toggle button, but we're going to get that same experience we're used to, where we can see which ones are chosen. If we make a small change and change these to radio, page is still the same, but they become single select. So this is where we're going to have it actually pick one of these as the favorite. They can't pick any of the other ones. Let's take a look at drop-downs next. Now let's see how to build a Bootstrap drop-down. We're going to start by just we're up in the menu, in the nav bar menu, and I want to create a drop-down inside the menu. So I'm going to just start with a list item, like you would expect. And I can start this by just creating a drop-down div element. This is going to be the container for the complete drop-down. And we're going to start with a button who has the title when people click will show the drop-down. In this case, I'll call this Planets. To make this look right, it's going to need the button, of course. I'm going to say button secondary here, just so we can see it a little differently. And then drop down toggle. We also need a data toggle here, and this will also be drop-down. So far in the browser, this is just going to look like a drop-down the way you'd expect it to, but we haven't created any of the items underneath it. So let's do that next. To do that, I'm going to create a drop-down menu element that's going to contain all our drop-down items. So we need to create the drop-down item, and we're going to want to create it by creating an anchor with the class of drop-down item, and then what is in that item will just be one of those options. And in this case, I'll put Mercury. I'll create 9 of those with my famous editor inheritance. And you did hear me right. I am going to create 9 of them and increase the controversy of this course by including Pluto. I'm a Pluto lover personally. If we look at these drop-down items now created inside the drop-down div, we can now see that we have the planets drop-down, and it actually works. And because each of these are just simply hrefs, I could link over to other pages this way, or I could use this in my forms or in other places as just a drop-down of different items. Instead of creating hrefs, you could also create this with other elements where you're going to interact with them. So instead of hrefs, these could be buttons as well that you could put events on or whatever you need it to be. The structure of what it's trying to do is the important piece. Let's look at input groups next. So let's talk about input groups now. I've come over to the sidebar, and if you remember, we put in this little search that we never really implemented or made look good. We're going to get rid of that search. Instead, we're going to create a div. We're going to give it the class of form group. The trick here is I'm also going to create one that's for an input group. And the idea of an input group is the same thing like a button group, but for some element and the actual input itself. So if we start with just an input that has form control in here, and the browser will just get that form control. It's also now sized to the sidebar, which is nice, but we just have this very simple input control. We could have gotten that without using the input group. The trick here is that you can then use an input group prepend, which is saying you want to, before the form control, show something. And then we can just create a span here that is of type of class input group text. In this case, I'll just put a little question mark there. So if we look, we have this prepended part of the input group, and notice like the button group, it has rounded it to make it look like it's part of one logical unit. And we can't really see the question mark, but if we come over here and highlight it, we'll see it is there. So the real issue is that if we add to the span text muted or some other color, let's say text success, we'll be able to then see the green question mark next to the search. This also works for adding something at the end of the search. Here we can add the same idea, except it is input group append meaning the end versus the beginning. And inside the append, instead of creating that span to just show text, we can actually put something like a button. We'll still need to specify the color in the button, and we can just say search. And now we have the question and the search. And of course, this isn't going to give us a whole lot of room, so we can make it a little better by actually making it smaller. We come here to input group and put input group SM. We can see everything got a little smaller, and frankly, I would remove the prepend in a real website, but for now, that should be good enough. And then we can go ahead and say search there. The idea of input groups is to really allow you to attach things on things that make it logically real. For example, let's add one to our email real quick. So we come up to the email input, we can just add our input group, make sure and leave the input inside of it, and then input group prepend, input group text, and I'm just going to put an @ in there, and I'm just going to make that text muted. And now we can see we have a little @ next to the email, and that might be an indicator to help people know what actually goes in that spot. You could create these for all the controls, of course, but that may not be the prettiest thing you want. But you can see that just adding these, or even refactoring by adding some of the buttons to just make the UI a little bit easier to work with. So now let's take a look at tooltips. So now let's look at how tooltips work. Over in the browser, I've found the images inside of the sidebar. And I'm just going to add a title for each one of these that has the same thing as the alt. This could say anything we want, but this will be what the user is going to actually see. And I just wanted to make it nice and simple. And if we look at it in the browser, when we hover over the image, we're going to get a tiny little pop-up that shows the title we had. But this is actually just how the browsers work. If you use title pretty much on anything, it'll show you this little pop-up. But that's probably not good enough for us. It's not stylized in any way. So if we come back here and add a second attribute called data toggle tooltip, I'll just copy that to each one of these. Back in the browser, we'll see nothing's really changed. And the reason is that Bootstrap's version of tooltips can be a little labor intensive. So instead of just making every element on the page hope that it'll have a title or hope that it'll have the data toggle in it, you actually have to opt into it. This is the first of several of the components that require you to do a little bit more work. Now, Tooltip and a couple of the other Bootstrap pieces that we're going to be using actually require a plugin called Popovers. Now, you can get that separately if you want, or you can just use the Bootstrap bundle version, which is the one that we included when we worked on the project initially. So this is going to include Popovers bundled into our project, but you may, for one reason or another, want to separate that out. In order to opt into it, we have to actually use some JavaScript. So we have a site.js here. Let's go ahead and include it as the last script. Just make sure it's happening after the loading of the other objects. So it shouldn't matter that much. And I'll just create a quick self-executing function because I don't really want this to be in the global scope. But here I can use jQuery because what Bootstrap has done is it's extended jQuery in order to do these things. So I could certainly just say document here and then just call tooltip in order to activate that. And this would take a look at everything in the document and apply tooltip, but that's not very performant. Instead, I'm going to look for an attribute called data toggle, which you might remember, and just look for wherever the tooltip is actually mentioned. So in this case, it'll only find the things on the page that already have the tooltip applied. The reason this can be useful is that if we wanted to change the way the tooltips work in general, we could actually add an options object here and make those changes. I'm not going to go through what's all involved there because it can get a little messy, but this should allow us to go back to the browser and we can now see that our tooltips are different. They're little pop-ups that are directional. They're prettier and more like what we want, but they're not exactly what we want. If we go back to the page, we can add another data element called placement to specify where we want it. So let's put the data placement of the Pluto one on the right, and let's, for the last one, we'll put it on the left. You can also put top or bottom as well. Back in the browser, we can see Pluto's on the right, Nebula's on the left, and then the other two are still on the top. So we can make that decision. And for most tooltips, that's going to be fine, because all we're really doing is specifying the text we want as the title. But let's say we wanted to include something more interesting here. Let's say instead of the title is just Pluto, let's say we wanted to include some embedded HTML like Pluto should be a planet. And that might be nice, but if we look at the tooltip, we can see it's not exactly what we want. And you may have noticed that it's actually showing up on the left-hand side. And the reason for that is the tooltips are smartly set up to make sure that they're not off the page. Because putting this on the right would make it fall off the page, it's forcing it onto the left. If we zoom out a little, we'll see that it still shows up on the right if there's room. But if we go back to where it doesn't fit, it'll be on the left. But let's make the HTML part of this actually work. The trick there is to add yet another data tag, and this one is data HTML equals true. This is just telling the plugin that it should expect in the title that there's going to be some HTML. Back in the browser, we can now see Pluto is a planet, and it's bolded, though it's a little hard to see here. Let's see if we bring it up. There it is. Pluto should be a planet. So let's look at alerts next. So now let's talk about alerts. Back on the contact page, let's go all the way to the top, just inside where it says contact me, and I'm going to add a new div here, and I'm just going to put some message like, please wait, like a wait cursor sort of thing. And if we give it the class of alert, we can see the please wait here, but it's just pretty much in a div, and that's because we've told it to look like an alert, but we didn't tell it how to color itself. So let's also add alert primary. And so this is effectively what an alert looks like. It's a block, usually using one of the standard colors to show a message to the user, sometimes temporarily, sometimes to show things like errors. If we change the color here, like secondary, just like everywhere else we've seen this, we can see the color change to whatever that secondary color is. More interesting is the warning and danger colors that can be used for a variety of occasions. It doesn't just need to be a simple piece of text. Really, any HTML you want to put in here will work. So if we put in ad hoc HTML, it will just work. Whether it looks good or not is a whole different question, but we can certainly see that any HTML we want to use works great. If you want to support the alert to be dismissible, so we'll just need a button with the class of close, and then we'll need to put whatever the icon is we want to be clicked when we close it. And a common one is just to use the time symbol. So you could put an X or whatever makes sense in your UI. This is more about building a button that will allow it to be closed. We're also going to want on the alert itself, alert dismissible. And now we can see that we have a little close button there. We're getting the right icon and everything, but it actually won't close it. The reason is we need one more small attribute called data dismiss equals alert. And this way it knows that when a close button is clicked to go ahead and get rid of the form. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit more like what we want it to be, which is, let's say primary, and let's get rid of the danger heading. Now back in the browser, we can see the please wait, and we can see the close button, and it actually works. So far, it just makes it go away, but to add some panache, some animation to make it look pretty, we can add a couple more classes here. One is called fade, and one is called show. Fade tells it what animation to use, and show tells it what state to leave in the beginning. In this case, we want it to show. So it's shown up. When we click it, there's a short fade. You can use the jQuery extensions to change the exact behavior. You can even use your own animations to slide it up or whatever you want it to do. But it's a good basis for a standard alert to let users know something weird or something wonderful has happened. Next, let's talk about popovers. So now let's see what a popover is. I'm back in the index.html. Let's make a little bit more room for our text here. And I want to make something to show some more information about the sunspots. Maybe the idea of a tooltip is too small. And so the idea here is to create a data toggle, just like we've done before, but use popover instead for this new kind of metaphor. And then we can say data content equals, and then put what actually should be in the popover. The difference between popovers and tooltips are in how they're activated, and you'll see that in a moment. But if we look at this in the browser, and we go down to this and click it, nothing happens. The popover is not activated by default. Much like the tooltips, we have to opt into them. So let's open back up our site.js, and let's look for data toggle popover, and call popover. Again, when you opt into this, you can change some of the default behavior of popover or even apply different versions of popover to different elements. So we're using the data toggle popover as a convenient way to find all the popovers, but you can imagine in different cases wanting to have different popover behavior. If we head back over to the browser, and now that we've enabled it, when we click on it, we can see our popover show up. So instead of the tooltip, which the look and feel is very much like that, you can have it after an activity. If you go into popover, you can also specify how it's launched, like setting it to hover, which here in the browser will just make it show up. Of course, that's just like what we were doing with the tooltips. So you may not actually want that. More commonly, you will just use popovers for interactive elements. Now, in this case, this isn't as interesting because we already have this idea of showing parts of our UI with this. But remember, you can put this on the smallest of things so that you can provide more data. The last piece of this puzzle is to come back over and add a title. We used title earlier when we were talking about tooltips to enable the text. But in this case, the title is going to be actually the title on the popover. So if I make that sunspots and come back over to the browser, you'll see that we're getting a more elaborate popover. So this would be the title of the popover, and then whatever you put in text will go ahead and show here, using the same semantics of making sure it's on screen and using the same attributes to change which corner of the container that you're actually going to show this on. So popovers and tooltips are pretty similar to each other, but do have some specific differences. Now let's take a look at cards. So now let's talk about what Bootstrap likes to call cards. In previous versions of Bootstrap, they had a few different kinds of things that represented containers that were stylized in certain ways. And in Bootstrap 4, they've centralized that into this one idea called cards. So let's take this story we have here and make it into a card. First thing to do is let's change this class from story, which is something we used in the boilerplate before we added Bootstrap, and we're just going to say card. And in the browser, we can see that it's given it this background and put everything inside this container into its own different background. All the content still works. Of course, it stretched this a little odd, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it's sort of akin to creating a card onto which you can put different elements. Let's add a couple of sub-elements to really start to pull this together. So let's take this first section and wrap it in a div that we're going to put as a class of card header. So it'll be the header for our card. And that same move will wrap everything else in a div that we'll call card body. If we look at the browser now, we'll see that there's a little bit more padding here on the stars of heaven, just no longer towards the edge. And same with all the text that's part of this story. But our image still looks pretty bad. So let's take this image. Let's move it inside and let's give it a new class of card image top. By making it image top, and we'll actually get rid of some of this other sizing we did earlier, so we can see that it now makes it the header for our card. Now, this image is really big, so it's probably not what we want to be as the header, but if it were smaller, it would actually just center it wherever it was in this object. In fact, if we just come here and do width 25 for 25% and get rid of the float right, so it really is just a card header, we'll see it just makes sure that it exists at the top of our card. If we put the float right back in and get rid of everything but the width 25, we get that same experience we were getting in the design earlier. But now it's in a section that has the idea of a header with a divider for the header. I'm not going to show it to you, but you can do the same thing with a card dash footer and have a footer with buttons or whatever you might want as part of that. You can also take the card body and give it a background based on one of our colors, like primary. And we'll see that this doesn't look all that great because it's left the header in this standard look and then it's colored the text inside of it and it's colored the background the way we want to, but it's not making this very readable at all. And so if we add again background and we do text white, we can force the text to be much more readable inside of our card here. And remember, cards can be of any real size. Often to get the look and feel we want here, we can also break these parts of the body. So you might imagine an H, let's say 5, and we could put in here a class of card title. Title says it's going to be a title within the body, and then these could also say card text, so that it knows it's a type of text in each one of these. So let's go ahead and add this down to the last paragraph as well. And it makes a little clearer what we're actually trying to do with these different pieces that are part of the card. So one sort of neat trick here is let's first move the background, primary, and text white up to the card so it affects not just the body, but the entire card. And let's assume that instead of wanting to float it right or make it smaller, that we actually want to use it as the background. In order to do that, let's just wrap this whole thing in its own div. And in this div, we're going to give it a special class called card image. Remember, we called that image a card image overlay. And if I've done this right, you can see we've overlaid over the entire element. Now, this isn't really that useful if you're using a header or a footer because it doesn't know the difference there. But of course, we could add some spacing here, but our image itself would have to make sense for us to want to do this. Of course, because we have this unordered list here, it would be really stupid to put it over the text. But you can see some of the power of what it is. I've only touched a very brief part of what the card can actually do. If you look at it, it's trying to replace a lot of things like catalog cards, gallery photos, interactable elements, all sorts of things. It's really the go-to container for whether you have something large like we're trying to do here or a bunch of small elements as well. Let's undo our changes here for just a moment. And we're back to what the story should really look like. Let's wrap up this module. So in this module, we've discovered some of the components in Bootstrap 4. Because websites can require these common metaphors, Bootstrap is trying to supply some. And remember, you're going to want to use these as often or as unoften as you want. Trying to shoehorn and use every component in your website is not going to make your website any better. But when you're trying to create certain things like popovers and alerts, this allows you to go to that common metaphor and just use it. You find yourself using the card metaphor probably quite a lot because it's such a powerful thing, from just a simple well to put content in to something much more elaborate that has a header and an image top and a footer, calls to action. All of that can be done with the card. And so components should give you a taste of some of the standard components in Bootstrap 4. In the next module, we're going to talk about some more advanced components that require a little bit more setup and sophistication.